Welcome dear students. Today our lecture is about IEE and EIA guidelines. In our previous lectures we were talking about the rules and regulations regarding IEE and environmental impact assessment. Today we will continue the same topic and we will try to find out what guidelines have been prepared by the Pakistan Environmental Protection Agency. Mainly, it is a continuation of our previous discussion, which was focused on the rules and regulations. So, those rules and regulations were prepared in the background of Environmental Protection Act 1997. So, first of all, you are very much well known with this act. We have gone through it thoroughly. And in this act, we had a section. And that section number 12 is entirely focused on initial environmental examination and environmental impact assessment, rules and regulations and procedures. So all the guidelines and some basic laws have been clarified in this section number 12. Based on these guidelines, we prepared some rules and regulations. These rules and regulations were actually prepared by the Pakistan Environmental Protection Agency, Federal Protection Agency, and then it was approved by the government, federal government, and then these were implemented. In addition to these rules and regulations, guidelines were also prepared by the Environmental Protection Agency. What was the purpose of those guidelines? Those guidelines were prepared so as to follow these rules and regulations. So those guidelines are in view of these rules and regulations. These rules and regulations are in view of this section number 12. So all the scope and limitations and the authorities and the responsibilities of different organizations have been clarified in this section. For example, who is authorized to make rules and regulations? Who are authorized to implement those rules and regulations? Who are going to be bound to obey those rules and regulations? These are three major things. All these things will have been described under this section number 12. So what was the purpose of this scoping and limitation? It was to provide a boundary is description which falls under this act, and based on those guidelines we can further develop the procedures. Those procedures now are existing in the form of guidelines, and those guidelines are actually under the theme which have been defined in this EIA, IEE and EIA rules and regulations. So these rules and regulations, we try to study these rules and regulations in our previous lecture, but now today we will be having an overview of IEE guidelines. So both these things are presented in a package of rules and regulations and guidelines made by Pakistan Environmental Protection Agency and approved by the government of Pakistan. So actually, if you overview all these scenario, it is not only one single thing, but these are correlated things. So IEE is working in coordination with these guidelines. Not only with these guidelines, but we have another thing as well. And what is that? That is the standards, National Environmental Quality Standards. Those standards are again approved by this Pakistan Environmental Protection Agency. So all these things are making up a package. All these components of this package are interrelated. When we talk about these guidelines, these are under these regulations. These are formed. These guidelines are developed in view of these regulations. And then, in view of these, then furthermore, we have an NEQS, National Environmental Quality Standards, which were prepared in view of the Environmental Protection Act 1997 in order to control the hazardous material and to control the hazardous wastewater pollution due to the industries. All these things we have discussed under this heading and in different sections. And then, in order to elaborate those things, we have NEQS, Environmental Quality. But under this section, we have these two things, and these two things are actually making a package to be followed. And whenever we will be conducting an IEE or EIA, we are bound to follow these guidelines and these rules and regulations. These both of them are under the view of this section, under the jurisdiction of the this enactment, which is this law, and then we have this section, and then we have these. What next we have today? We are going to describe the guidelines for preparation and review of environmental reports. What are the environmental reports? These are IEE reports, the EIA reports. So on the basis of what we are going to conduct these impact assessment procedures. So if we, again, it is a big document which need to be reviewed, but just for the sake of an overview, it is having about 9 parts, and starting with the very basics, like what's the scope and what are the different definitions in this, and then we have integrated environmental assessment. What is that? And then some making environmental assessment credible and fair. These all things are the guidelines. These are when we are developing IEE and EIA, we have these standards, we have these guidelines. And it is not possible to achieve in the best of our research and our assessment. So, in order to make it more and more near to our target, in order to cover all the aspects which are expected in, for a typical project, we need to go through all these 9 points in deeply. So we will be talking about these points, which are introduction, commencing environmental assessment, and assessing the impact, how the impact will be assessed, what kind of guidelines we are required about the assessing task, how we are going to assess. So we need some guideline. So we are providing guideline in this document. Impact identification. What are the methods through which we are going to identify the impact? How that impact is going to be analyzed, and how it is going to be predicted. Because every environmental impact is not for a short time. It can have a longer duration. It can have a longer impact. So we need to predict how long this impact is going to sustain. So then we need some baseline data collection about the water resources, about the groundwater resources, about the natural habitat, about the soil properties, about the water properties, so about the land usage. All these things are in the baseline data collection. Then characteristics of the impact. what kind of impact it is going to have, prediction methods, social impacts, health impact, economic and fiscal impacts. So these are about the project, that the project is going to give us some benefits, some financial improvement of the residents of the vicinity, or having some negative impacts. So all these need to be assessed. Then, if we have some negative impact of any feature which has been observed, we need to have a mitigation plan. And how we are going to implement that mitigation plan, we need to properly suggest the solution, and here are the guidelines for those impacts and then mitigation. And then we have some reporting mechanisms. These are the guidelines to prepare the drafting style, features, so that nothing is missed. We are covering all the aspects. What possible shortcomings of the report can be? These are also mentioned here, so that we can focus and we can improve these shortcomings and reduce the negativity. Then reviewing and decision making. In our rules and regulations, we studied that the decision making is not based only on the report, but it will be also based on the stakeholders and the public participation and the public response, and all these things will be finally included and incorporated that the EIA and IEE are going to be approved, or it needs some revision. So whatever the decision will be, it need to have some description, it need to have some guidelines. So these are the guidelines. Steps in reviewing the report, determining the remedial options, decision making process, and checks and balances. All these things are covered here. Then monitoring and auditing. So the process of monitoring and auditing, again in our rules and regulations we have studied that there is requirement of continuous monitoring of all the compliances which have been falling under the heading of this mitigation. So when once the project is complete, after that, after 1 year of that, we need to submit a monitoring and auditing report about the environmental aspects which earlier had some negative impact, and in order to overcome those negative impacts, we had a mitigation plan. And how successful that mitigation plan has been throughout the year, it needed to be addressed in this monitoring and auditing report which is to be submitted. We studied this as a rule and regulation in our previous lecture. You can check it. So please compare it with that rule and regulation. What was that rule and regulation, and how it is going to be implemented? Environmental engineer, when you will be working on EIA, you need all these guidelines to be followed, and at the same time you need to correlate these guidelines with the rules and regulations. For example, monitoring and auditing is going to be linked with that rule and regulation, which is a compulsory requirement, mandatory requirement by the proponent of the project to be submitted within a specific duration of 1 year, and it will be continuous. After every 1 year you need to submit that report. So this will be a continuous activity. Now that similarly we have other aspects which will be covered here. Mitigation and reporting is again it has some rules and regulations which are described in the in that document which we earlier discussed. And then we have some procedures which need to be followed, which we have discussed in the previous lecture. So these are interlinked things. First of all, make it sure these are guidelines which are following those rules and regulations. These are interlinked thoroughly and interconnected. And whenever we will be working on these guidelines, we obviously need to understand under what rule and regulation we are doing this activity, and we are doing this activity of assessment, and we are doing this mitigation plan. So these are linked with the rules and regulations. So your duty is to understand which part of rule and regulation is linked with this part, and then similarly uh, which part is linked with this reporting rules and regulations. Here we have given the guidelines, but rules and regulations are provided in another uh, which is more legal and authorized. And once you prepare these follow these guidelines, you are actually following those rules and regulations. Those rules and regulations have the powers to make you accountable. If the report preparation process have some faults, those faults and those discrepancies will be discussed in view of the relevant rule and regulation. So those rules and regulations must be completely understood. Now we will try to have a quick review about uh, these guidelines. So these guidelines for the preparation and review of environmental report, these are the points which we talked about earlier. And now if you see here, these are the detail of the guidelines. What is the context? Uh, in the first heading, it is this guideline is part of a package of regulations and guidelines which include first of all this ordinance, and then it has the policy for filing, then it has the guidelines for preparation and review of the report, it has the public participation guidelines for sensitive and critical areas, this is the NQS. All these things are interrelated. These are the so this guideline should not be read on its own, but in the context of the overall package. This is what I was earlier talking about. These guidelines must be followed in view of the rules and regulations. Then we have scope. So these guidelines have a general scope, general nature, and if we are talking about something specific, because it depends on what kind of project we are working on, then we need some specific guidelines for those. So these guidelines are only for general nature projects. If we are working on some specific project, we might have specific guidelines to follow them. For example, for more hazardous projects, we have some more guidelines, more specific guidelines which we need to follow. For general projects of any kind of construction or any kind of road construction or dam construction, we can follow these guidelines. Then it is something about integrated environmental assessment. All the environmental assessment parameters are interlinked. We cannot isolate the impact, because once we are having a air pollution impact, it is not only affecting the atmosphere, it is also affecting the environmental issues.